When Sarah, a single mother, extended a helping hand to her elderly neighbor, Michael, she had no inkling of the darkness that lay beneath. The nightmarish twist that took place will leave you on the edge of your seat. In 2014, when Sarah, a 32-year-old single mother, moved into a charming townhouse in the Silverstone community in the eastern suburbs of London, she felt that luck was finally beginning to shine on her. This mother of 3 boys had gone through challenging times. For months, she eagerly awaited the allocation of public housing while living with her mother, so finally having her own home for herself and her children was a true relief. Her eldest sons, 12-year-old Bradley and 11-year-old twins Alfie and Reese, were about to start middle school. She was happy to provide her boys with stability through this home. It's a peaceful neighborhood where the family feels safe and the boys quickly make new friends. After the trials they've endured, it's a breath of fresh air for the small family, which wastes no time in settling into the neighborhood. In front of Sarah and her son's new residence, in a building dedicated to social housing in the neighborhood, lived Michael Pleasted, who was 77 years old. This man stood out due to his unique character. It was impossible to miss this character. He spent his time sitting on a bench in front of a newsstand. He was smiling and quite helpful. Everyone in the neighborhood said hello to him. In exchange for a small fee, he sorted the newspapers at the newsstand, and it wasn't uncommon for young people from the neighborhood to help him, especially on Saturdays when they didn't have school. Sarah, who had a kind heart, was quickly touched by this elderly man who lived alone. Naturally generous, she bonded with him. When she cooked a good meal, she didn't hesitate to share a portion with him. These moments were an opportunity to converse and brighten his isolated day. Sarah often joined him for tea. In her eyes, Michael was a charming old man. Moreover, Michael was very active at the local community center. He often wore a work jacket provided by the center, enhancing his status in the neighborhood. He enjoyed a certain esteem and was widely respected by the locals. After a few months, Michael suggested to Sarah that she hire her eldest son, Bradley, to work at the community center on weekends. Sarah was deeply touched by this proposal, seeing it as a great opportunity for her son. Bradley, on the other hand, was enthusiastic about helping his mother during his free time. He also had a great affection for Michael. Over time, Michael managed to gain the trust not only of Sarah and Bradley, but also of the 11-year-old twin boys, Alfie and Reese. It wasn't uncommon for him to invite the boys to his home. However, a few weeks later, Bradley's behavior changed dramatically. He became withdrawn, avoided all contact, and expressed a total refusal to return to the community center. Faced with this sudden change, Sarah was worried. She tried to understand what was tormenting her son, but Bradley insisted that he didn't want to set foot in the center again. Respecting her son's feelings, Sarah decided not to force him, wishing above all for his well-being. A few weeks later, the twins, Alfie and Reese, made a terrible confession to their mother. It wasn't an easy thing to say, but they couldn't keep it to themselves any longer. They told her that one afternoon, while they were at Michael's house, the old man abused them. Sarah was shocked. She couldn't find the words. She couldn't believe it. After she trusted him so much, offering him help and food, she even entrusted her children to him, and he abused them. Like many people in the neighborhood, she was duped by this seemingly kind old man, to whom one would have given his confession. After the trauma of these terrible revelations, Sarah decided to take action. She immediately goes to the police station to lodge a complaint against Michael. A few hours later, the 67-year-old was arrested. He was accused of child abuse, and the investigation began. And what the investigators discovered was extremely disturbing. When they checked the old man's criminal record, they found that he was far from unknown to their department. Michael was, in fact, a sexual abuser already heavily convicted, who changed his name in order to pass his sentence. His real name was Robin Molt, and he was on probation after being charged with multiple sexual crimes. Over the years, he had accumulated 24 convictions, mainly for child abuse between 1970 and the late 1990s. He served numerous prison sentences, the longest lasting 6 years, for abusing 2 teenagers. The shocking thing was that no one in the neighborhood knew his background or his true identity. He presented himself as a friendly neighbor. Having changed his name, he even managed to obtain new official documents, including an identity card and driver's license in the name of Michael Pleasted. He was not on the sex offenders register as he committed his crimes before the introduction of this register. It was in the 72nds, when he was in his 30s, that his name was mentioned for the first time. Living in southwest London at the time, he was known by his real name as a predator in need of medical intervention. For almost 3 decades, he committed a series of assaults against young boys and numerous stints in prison. At the end of the 92nds, after an umpteenth release from prison, he had made an official request to change his name. Upon acceptance, he had received new identity documents and had become, as I mentioned earlier, Michael Pleasted. Wanting to start afresh, he had left southwest London to settle in the east suburbs, where his face was unknown. He had applied for social housing and had been quickly assigned an apartment located just across from Sarah and her children's future residence. What was even more alarming was that despite his troubled past, his accommodation had offered a direct view of a playground and an elementary school. During that period, he wasn't required to disclose his previous convictions or his change of identity to the municipality. 2 years before the tragic events involving Sarah's children in July 2012, an alert regarding Michael had been raised. He was suspected of having an affair with a teenager. When a social worker spoke with this young person and their family, they had chosen not to file a complaint. Consequently, no investigation was conducted and Michael's dark past remained hidden. However, the community center where he had volunteered had requested a copy of his criminal record, but Michael always managed to find a good excuse not to provide it. The center had taken the initiative to contact the police 3 times to obtain information about Michael, but they were unable to find specific details about his history. When checking records under his assumed name, the police found no mention of him. The police officer didn't dig any deeper, even though a simple search in the National Police files would reveal his 24 convictions and the various aliases he had used. However, this verification process wasn't undertaken because Michael expressly refused to allow these data to be accessed. Unaware of his dark past, the center allowed him to volunteer, believing he had no unsupervised contact with children. Despite serious charges and a lengthy criminal history, a judge granted him bail pending trial, which shocked the family's mother. Although accused of assaulting her 11-year-old twins, Michael was released and returned to their neighborhood. The judge imposed one condition: he couldn't have children in his apartment. Sarah was outraged by this situation. How could they subject her children to such a trial, knowing that they could encounter him at any moment? It was unacceptable. Consumed by worry, she contacted the law enforcement authorities for an explanation. The prospect of encountering this terrible predator at their doorstep was an unbearable source of stress for Sarah and her children. Despite the compassion of the police, they had explained to her that they were bound by the court's decision to ensure her family's safety during the trial. They recommended that she seek refuge with relatives. This situation was incomprehensible for Sarah. Despite her children being the true victims, they were compelled to flee their own home, while Michael, the accused, had remained peacefully on his own. Confronted with this dramatic scenario, she had chosen to take refuge at her mother's. It was she who found herself obligated to disrupt her life, quit her job, and uproot her sons from their school and friends. She was deeply outraged by such injustice, leading to extreme disappointment and a loss of faith in the police and the justice system of her country. For many weeks, Sarah and her sons lived in constant anxiety, with nightmares frequently disrupting the boys' sleep. Consumed by guilt and sorrow, Sarah had perpetually reflected on how she could have given this individual the opportunity to betray his trust and abuse her children. She had opened her heart to him, offered her assistance without ever harboring doubts, and today she was overwhelmed by a profound sense of guilt. However, living with her 3 children at her mother's place had become too complex. She had, therefore, made the decision to return to the walls of her own house. The situation was extremely delicate and burdensome. Michael lived quietly across the road. By opening the window, they were able to see his apartment. What was the most bewildering was that Michael had denied the accusations by pleading not guilty. As a result, these children had to endure a trial and relive these traumatic events, an excruciating ordeal for them. In the meantime, the investigation continued. Due to his close relationship with Michael, Bradley, the eldest of the siblings, was also questioned by the authorities. It was on this occasion that he revealed that he too had been a victim of assaults by the old man. It had only been after these new revelations that Sarah learned the terrible truth. After the interrogation, she found her eldest son huddled in his room, in crisis. He was pulling out his hair, unable to stop rocking, trembling, and crying. He felt guilty for not telling the truth earlier, which would have prevented his younger brothers from being assaulted in turn. Seeing her son's distress, Sarah was deeply touched. On November 28, 2014, after learning that her eldest son had also been a victim of Michael, Sarah decided to take action. She was determined she was going to confront that old pervert in his apartment. However, fear had taken over and she needed to muster up courage. She then drank 2 bottles of wine and a flask of brandy. Then, quite intoxicated, she put on a hooded suit, grabbed a kitchen knife to ensure her defense in case things had gone awry, and left her home. She crossed the street and entered Michael's building. She had been caught on surveillance cameras. Her objective was clear: to put pressure on him, demanded that he stop his lies, admit his heinous acts, and plead guilty to spare his sons the trauma of testifying in court. But things hadn't gone as she had planned. He opened the door for her, let her in, then returned to his usual chair near the window. Facing him, she discovered a radically different man. Far from being conciliatory, he was icy, unrecognizable compared to the benevolent old man she had supported for months. All he had found to say was that his sons were liars who ruined his life. What was worse, he openly laughed at her, provoked her, and had never admitted to the effect. Sarah, consumed by uncontrollable anger, had suddenly brandished the knife she had concealed in her pocket to threaten him. However, Michael did not back down. He got up from his chair and lunged at her to disarm her, but Sarah reacted quickly and struck him in the face. After that, she went into a wild rage. All the anger she had accumulated against him had unleashed, and she had stabbed him 8 times. Michael, seriously injured but still alive, had collapsed. In a desperate attempt, he had tried to drag himself towards the exit, as if in a final instinct for survival. That's when Sarah had snapped back to reality. She was shaken and had decided to flee. Walking over Michael's bloodied body, now lying in the hallway, she hastily exited the apartment and slammed the door behind her. Shortly after, Michael had taken his last breath. Once again captured by the surveillance cameras in the lobby, Sarah could be seen with the knife still in her hand, in tears and clearly in a state of shock. She had returned home and had called one of her confidants, believing she had killed her son's assailant. Early the next morning, she had gone to the police station to confess everything. The officer who took her interview found her terrified. The day before, she went to Michael's place to reason with him, but things spiraled and she handed him the knife. While she had been questioned, a team was immediately sent to the old man's residence. They had found him dead in the hallway where Sarah had stepped over him the previous day. It was during this interrogation that the mother learned the news. She then declared, now he can't harm the children anymore. She reported that she had never intended to kill him. Her initial goal was simply to threaten him to convince him to plead guilty. Unfortunately, the situation situation escalated when she realized he was mocking her and her sons and all the harm he had done to them. Hearing him sneer at the situation was unbearable for her. Following her confession, she was arrested, charged with murder, and incarcerated. The news spread throughout the neighborhood, causing shockwaves. Neighbors discovered with astonishment that they had unknowingly lived next to a sexual offender. Indignation was widespread. Even though no one had approved of Sarah's act, everyone believed that she should never have been pushed to such a level of despair. The authorities had been strongly criticized. How is it possible that this repeat child abuser could secure housing across from a kindergarten and a school? It had only been 3 days after his death that the City Hall had discovered the full extent of the man to whom they had granted social housing for 16 years. Municipal authorities had stated, "We never intended to put children in danger. However, based on the information available to us, we couldn't do anything to prevent this situation." In June 2015, after spending 10 months in detention, Sarah's trial had begun. It was an extremely painful ordeal for the mother. Seated on the defendant's bench, she hadn't been able to stop crying. In front of the jury, she had repeated that she never intended to kill or even harm him. She had just wanted to plead with him to plead guilty to spare her children from having to testify in a trial they had already suffered so much from. Her lawyers had recounted how difficult it had been for her and her children to learn that Michael was released and allowed to return to his home in their neighborhood. The charges against her had been lowered from voluntary manslaughter to involuntary manslaughter, and she pleaded guilty. After 3 days of deliberation, the jury, composed of 10 women and 2 men, had sentenced her to 3.5 years in prison. Having already served 10 months, she spent an additional 32 months behind bars. Sarah expressed her deep regrets emotionally regarding her actions, and tears flowed upon hearing the verdict. The judge, during the verdict, acknowledged Sarah's altered mental state at the time of the incident, highlighting the exceptional circumstances. She noted her swift surrender to the police, intense stress, acceptance of responsibility, lack of evidence tampering, and display of remorse. Unfortunately, weeks later, the Supreme Court deemed her initial sentence too lenient, extending it to 7.5 years. It was argued that Sarah had carried the weapon with full consciousness and failed to seek help after the attack. Her ordeal continued as she faced years in prison, leaving her children without her presence. Sarah's grandmother cared for them during her incarceration. Sarah battled deep depression initially but found strength through her love for her children, maintaining daily contact to wish them well. Nights were certainly the hardest for the boys. It was common for them to wake up crying and calling for their mother. Every month, their grandmother would take them to the prison to visit Sarah. It was painful for Sarah not to be with her children daily, not to see them grow and develop. During her incarceration, an online petition had been started demanding her release, although it likely did not receive much media attention. In the end, after 4 years of imprisonment, including her time in pretrial detention, Sarah was released. She was finally able to reunite with her children. Following this harrowing ordeal, they decided to settle in Essex County. Their bond now appeared stronger than ever. However, Sarah's fight didn't end there. In 2022, she embarked on efforts to reform legislation. She joined forces with Sarah Champion, an activist MP, to advocate for stricter regulations regarding individuals who want to change their identities. Together, they argued that these sexual offenders should not have the right to do so. Allowing them to change their names and obtain new identity documents provided these individuals with the perfect opportunity to disappear and reoffend discreetly, much like what Michael had done. Sarah wanted passports and identity cards to have distinctive marks to facilitate their identification. A government spokesperson indicated that they had considered the proposal, but ultimately rejected it. They pointed out that the UK already had one of the world's strictest legislation regarding sexual offenders, and no additional measures would be taken. Following her release, Sarah was invited to several television shows and spoke through various media outlets. She admitted that she had never thought she would be capable of such an act. And although she deeply regrets her actions, she emphasizes that by doing so, she removed a child predator from the streets. She shared that her mother had taught her to always take responsibility, which is why she had gone directly to the police, even though it had been very difficult. She confessed that her time in prison had profoundly affected and transformed her, just as it had impacted her children. She stated, "I will never commit such an act again. I do not see myself as a murderer. Although I deeply regret my actions, I was a desperate mother at that moment, willing to do anything to defend my children." Sarah's sons, on the other hand, waived their right to anonymity to support their mother. They talked about how growing up without her for all those years had been challenging. The twins, now 18 years old, mentioned that despite her incarceration, she remained very involved in their upbringing. Whenever they wanted to play football with their friends, their grandmother sought their mother's approval. Bradley, now 19, stated that when he learned that his mother had stabbed her attacker, he was proud of her. The twins shared that even though they no longer had their mother by their side, knowing that she had killed their assailant made them feel safe. Thus, they could go out without fear of encountering him on the corner. To her children, Sarah is a hero. The family tirelessly worked to rebuild their lives and put the past behind them, although nothing could compensate for the lost 4 years or erase the trauma from Michael's abuse. Sarah, a kind-hearted woman, extended warmth to an elderly neighbor she believed to be estranged, tragically falling victim to his manipulation, which ultimately harmed her children. What's truly horrifying is Michael's exploitation of legal loopholes, such as changing his name and evading registration as a sex offender, allowing him to blend into the community with impunity. The judge's decision to release him on bail, knowing his victims lived nearby, adds to the injustice. Sarah felt abandoned by the justice system and took desperate measures to protect her children, though her actions resulted in a tragic turn of events. While taking the law into your own hands is not the solution, it's essential to empathize with her plight. Sarah is now free, striving to rebuild her life with her sons and share her story through her book Loss of Control by Sarah Sands. This story serves as a cautionary reminder that true monsters can lurk behind appearances. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to follow for more crime stories.